Hello viewers, welcome to week 8 lecture 2 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I am going to talk about French post-structuralist thinker Jacques Lacan, Julia Kristeva and Michel Foucault, and in what ways they contributed to this thought process of post-structuralism. Uh, as we know that uh, Jacques Lacan and Derrida with his deconstruction and Lacan with his psychoanalytic theory, they exercised a huge influence, a deep and pervasive influence on the second half of the 20th century. Most important contribution of Lacan was to reinterpret the theories of Sigmund Freud in the light of post-structuralist ideas, especially psychoanalysis as Lacan tries to understand it. It is in context of Derridian notions and views of deconstruction. Uh, Lacan says that the unconscious is structured like a language. So, here Lacan tries to understand the structure of the unconscious very much in terms of language and various dimensions of language. For example, if Freud in his psychoanalytic theories focused on the author or character, Lacan focuses on the language. And in this way, this emphasis on language or understanding of psychoanalysis in terms of the structure of language, it gives it a post-structuralist dimension. For example, Lacan maintains that the unconscious exists only when an individual has an access to the system of language. And in this way, this unconscious is structured around irreducible signifiers. And this very thought makes Lacan a post-structuralist thinker. In fact, Lacan, tries to explain these things in context of the birth of an infant. He says that when we are born with many legs. So our birth is itself a fragmentary process, right? And then Lacan, talks about the development of infant or development of child in 3 stages. So the first stage he calls is mirror stage. Mirror stage is the stage of infant from 6 months to 8 months, right? And in this mirror stage, Lacan says that a child or an infant has no subject of its own at all, right? So it is a phase in which the child, looks at a mirror and he starts, observing certain, operation processes unconsciously. The other stage he calls is imaginary stage, that roughly, falls between 8 months to 17 months. And this phase is called pre-Oedipal phase or pre-language phase. This is the phase in which, the child has not yet, entered the system of language. So in this imaginary phase, he says that, that infant is not aware of any subject, any identity of his own. He cannot, distinguish his identity from the identity of others. And he says that you can realize this thing when you see a number of children are kept together at a place, maybe in a hospital. Those infants are kept, and there you find that how if one infant cries, all the other infants also start crying. So, that is a psychological process in which the subject is not able to distinguish itself from the object. Right. So, in this way, now he moves to the third stage, that is the symbolic stage, and which starts 18 months onwards or around that time. This is the time when the infant enters the system of language. And when the infant enters the system of language, what he realizes, as Lacan has said, that we are born with various legs. So these legs are always there. And in this way, when we have legs, so the natural outcome of this leg is desire of the other, right? So the other is desired, and in this way, in this process, this human subject is never satisfied, because these legs are continual. And if we look at the nature of language, as we have seen in post-structuralist thinking, that how language isolates the human subjects from the reality or from the real, confirming the subject to the realms of signifiers which have no stability. So, in this way, he wants to say that though human subject starts realizing itself, but because he realizes himself always in terms of lacks. So, to fulfill those lacks, he always desires the other. And this desiring this other or attaining the other, it is very much like a mirage, as we have seen in Derridean notion of signifier and signified, that how signifiers in desire to complete themselves in sense of meaning, they keep moving from one to other and ad infinitum. It goes on ad infinitum. So, in this way, these signifiers keep moving from one subject to other, or one subject to other in desire of another object, and they keep moving from one to other. So, this is applicable to human subject as well, and in this way human subject remains incomplete, always caught between the flux of signifiers, and it represents a kind of stability. So, in a way, Lacan is trying to say that usually what we imagine as a conscious self, a unified entity, that is a myth, that is an illusion. And in this way, he tries to understand these psychological processes in terms of language. He says that in this way, a child's entry into language, the child finds himself in a subject position within a relational system. For example, male or female, father and mother, son and daughter, right. So, in this way we find that the psychoanalytic writings of Lacan have given critics a new theory of the subject. Usually we find that how in Marxist, formalist or structuralist traditions, there was this dismissal of subjective criticism, as we have seen since the beginning of this course, that how this subjective criticism was always ignored. It was considered to be a romantic tendency, right. However, here we find that how Lacan gives it an altogether different orientation. For example, what in this way, what these post-structuralists are doing, they are entering into the gap that exists between the subject and the object. For example, if we speak a subject that I am going to meet you, in which we decide that I is subject, you is object. But at the same time, if we look at a response when you is speaking, so you becomes I becomes you. So far as this romantic tradition is concerned, romantic tradition has evaded this gap between I and you, and their interchangeability, and their instability of the subject-object position, right. However, these post-structuralists, in this way, they are different from those romantics, that they enter into this gap between I and you. And in this way, Lacan considers the human subjects, and when they enter a pre-existent system of signifiers which take on meanings only within a language system. Right. So, outside the language system, there is no meaning of the subject. So, this process and stages which precede it are governed by the unconscious. Right. So, he goes on to say that before gender or identity is established, these libidinal drives, they have no definite sexual object. There is only the rule of pleasure principle. But once it enters the symbolic system, or what is called the reality principle, there you find that eventually, it supervenes in the form of the father, who threatens the child's Oedipal desire for the mother with the punishment of castration. So, in this way, if we look at that, Freud's theory of mother fixation and how the fear of father figure or authority, right. So, there we find that he is trying to, Lacan is trying to reinterpret that theory in terms of that language and its isolation from the reality principle. So, in this way, we can see that Lacan's distinction between imaginary and symbolic, it corresponds to Julia Kristeva's distinction between the semiotic and the symbolic that we will be taking after discussing Lacan. So, the imaginary is a state in which there is no clear-cut distinction between subject and object. In the pre-linguistic mirror phase, the child, from within this imaginary state of being, starts to project a certain unity into the fragmented self-image in the mirror. So, the subject in that way produces only a fictional ideal that is called an ego. And in this way, the imaginary tendency continues even after the formation of the ego, because the myth of a unified selfhood depends on the ability to identify with the objects in the world of others. So, that is what he is saying, that this imaginary continues to operate with desires to attain object for its fulfillment. However, this object is always unattainable. And in this way, this symbol of phallus, and that is what he calls in Lacan's system, the privileged signifier, which helps all signifiers achieve a unity with their signifieds. So, in the symbolic domain, right, Lacan says, the phallus, not the penis but its symbol, reigns supreme. So, in this way, we find that neither the imaginary nor the symbolic can comprehend the real. And in this way, real always remains out there, somewhere beyond their reach. And this desire is endless. So, desire can be seen as running on in chains of signifiers, which are always shifting from one domain to other domain. Further, we can see how Lacan reinstates Freud's theories in the language of Saussure or Derrida. Unconscious processes are identified with the unstable signifier. So, in this way, we find that in Lacan's version of the sign, the signified slides beneath a signifier which floats constantly. Right. So, in this way, when the subject enters the symbolic order, it becomes daughter or son, but it is never complete like any other signifier. And in this way, we find that how Lacan, reverses that age-old dictum that was given by the French philosopher Descartes, I think, therefore I am, while Lacan is trying to prove that, Mr. Descartes, you are where you think not. So, I am never where I think. In this way, you know how that age-old dictum or notion of enlightenment is reversed or turned upside down. Further, you know, if we look at Freud's theory, how, you know, in his dream analysis, he says that how dream image undergoes two processes, condensation and displacement. Condensation is something in which several images combine together. Displacement is something in which one image is replaced by the other. And in this way, significance, you know, shifts from one to other as a contiguous one. So Lacan calls this condensation as metaphor and displacement as metonymy, right? So Lacan believes that the garbled and enigmatic dream work follows the laws of signifier. For him, there never were any undistorted signifiers. So in this way, we find that how his psychoanalysis is the scientific rhetoric of the unconscious. And in the light of these, Lacan's analysis of Poe's The Purloined Letter is very interesting incident in this context, right? So if we look at that story by Edgar Allan Poe, the story is divided into two episodes. And you know, there are notable characters such as the Queen, the Minister, the Chief of the Police, Dupin, the Chief Investigator or Detective, and uh, uh, the King himself, right? What we find that as the story begins, the minister finds that, you know, the Queen has left a letter on the table unattended, and somehow the king enters the chamber of the Queen or the boudoir without any information. So, you know, there the minister finds that the Queen is very anxious about that letter which is lying there. So the minister notices this anxiety of the Queen, and to placate that anxiety, he replaces that letter. When the king is not attentive to that letter, the minister replaces that letter by another letter. You know, at that moment, the Queen is unable to intervene because of the presence of the king. She feels helpless there. After that, the Queen, you know, summons the chief of the police and she asks him to find out the letter. The chief of the police, he tries to find out the letter, but he fails to find it out. And then there is this entry of Dupin the detective, right? The detective is, you know, searching for the letter, and then he locates that letter in minister house, which is, or in minister's chamber, which is kept in a card rack above the mantelpiece. When Dupin finds that supposed letter, he replaces that letter with another letter, right? And in this way, you know, the minister is frantically searching for the letter. In the end, when the minister gets this letter, he finds something that is written on that letter, in which Dupin declares that he has taken a revenge for some wrong that the minister had done to him uh, previously in life. So in this way, this short story is this analysis of short story from Lacanian's point of view is an exemplar, right? There we find that the content of the letter, which may be called the signified, which may be called the desired object, with which a queen or the minister or even the king might be expecting some fulfillment, that remains elusive, and they are not able to have any access to the content of that letter. So in this way, you know, Lacan points out that how letters' content are never revealed in the story. And the other thing that we notice, that the story's development is shaped not by the character of individuals or the contents of the letter, but by the position of the letter in relation to the trio of persons in each episode. So here we find that how Lacan contended that the story illustrates the psychoanalytic theory that the symbolic order is constitutive of for the subject, and the subject receives a decisive orientation from the itinerary of signifiers. And Lacan treats the story as an allegory of psychoanalysis, but also considers psychoanalysis as a model of fiction. The repetition of the structure of scene 1 in scene 2 is governed by the effects of pure signifier, that is the letter. And in this way, the characters moves into their places as the unconscious prompts. Let us quickly talk about another French thinker, that is Julia Kristeva, a Bulgarian French philosopher and psychoanalyst. You know, his important works are Desire in Language or Revolution in Poetic Language, Time in Sense, Powers of Horror, etc. And his theories have a psychoanalytic framework. We find that Julia Kristeva has contributed equally to the field of psychoanalysis and the field of literary criticism. Here, in that, the most important thing that Kristeva points out in Revolution in Language, she explores the processes by which what is ordered and rationally accepted is continually being threatened by the heterogeneous and the irrational. So, in this way, Kristeva says that when we look at the development of the Western thought, there is always this idea of unified subject, right, or unified consciousness. This unified consciousness is something through which we know, and that is how she tries to understand in terms of the structure of a syntax. So, an ordered syntax is one in which subject, verb, object are in order. So, region or order, that is governing the sense. However, she says that there are many subversive things such as wine, sex, song, laughter or poetry, and she associates these things with desire. So, in this way, this authority of region or order is always being threatened by the desire, right? And she says that poetic language demonstrates how dominant social discourses can be undermined by the creation of new subject position. So, far from being a mere blank which awaits its social and sexual role, the subject is in process and is capable of being other than that it actually is. So, in this way, Kristeva offers a complex psychological account of the relationship between the normal and the poetic. Right? She says that human beings, their entity can be taken as a space in which physical and psychic impulses flow. These physical and psychic impulses, they are in a flux, indefinite flux, and how that flux is always being regulated by things like society, family, etc. Right. So, she says that in pre-Oedipal phase, the flow of impulses center on the figure of mother. A disorganized pre-linguistic flux of movements and gestures lay the foundation of semiotic material which remains active beneath the performance of adult. So, in this way, she calls this pre-linguistic, pre-Oedipal material as symbolic, and it is attached with mother and it is poetic process, right, because it is like an unorganized signifying process, as we see images in a dream which are organized or related in an unorganized way. For example, she says that if you look at Malam's poetry, rhythm and sound pattern there, they may be taken as something liberated from the unconscious. So, in this way she says that the sound in poetry is relatable to primal sexual impulses. So, she says that in this way, with the passage of time, when this semiotic is regulated, its beaten path becomes the logic and rationality of the adult. And that is called the symbolic order, very much as we have understood, very much like as we have understood in terms of Lacan, right. So, the symbolic works with the substance of semiotic and achieves a certain mastery over it, but can never produce its own signifying substance. So, in this way, poetic language introduces the subversive openness of the semiotic across society's close symbolic order. And in this way, we find that how semiotic is associated with poetry and symbolic is associated with prose. Now, let us also talk about another post-structuralist thinker, that is Michel Foucault. And Foucault is very remarkable for his contribution of concepts such as knowledge and power, madness and civilization, or the archaeology of knowledge, as we find in the order of things, right. And in what way Foucault is a post-structuralist? That he of course believes in the discursive practices, he believes in Derridean notion of language and centrality of language. However, Foucault believes that language cannot exist independent of society, and language, society and state, they are in relation of a power dynamics that cannot be ignored. So, his ideas were very much influenced by the German philosopher Nietzsche, as we know that Nietzsche has a very deep and pervasive influence on post-structuralist thought and his will to power. So, Foucault goes on to say that what we have to decide, the desire is always there, what we have to do, what we have to perform. And in this way, we want to fit that desire with the facts that we have. So, this will to power is the fundamental principle. And in this way, he says that, as Nietzsche had said, that truth is an illusion. It cannot be, attained because language is an army of metaphors and metonymy. Similarly, Foucault also believes that truth is always, subjective, and it is truth only because it has the support of the intellectual order and the state which is in power at a given time. So, there is no universal truth. Therefore, he talks about epistemes, how these epistemes, units of power or these relationships of power or knowledge, they keep changing and the notion of knowledge always keeps changing, right. So, people recognize a particular piece of philosophy or scientific theory as true only if it fits the description of truth laid down by intellectual or political authorities of the day. Like other post-structuralists, Foucault regards discourse as a central human activity, but not as a universal or general text. It is a vast sign of signification. So, in this way, Foucault is interested in the historical dimension of discursive change. He says that, for example, even in science, a theory is not recognized in its own period if it does not conform to the power consensus of the institutions and official organs of science. For example, he says that Mendel's genetic theory, which fell on deaf ear in 1860s, and people had to wait until the beginning of the 20th century to accept that theory. So, he says that it is not enough to speak the truth, one must be in the truth. For example, he says that in his work Madness and Civilization, that earlier madness was free. For example, in 16th, 17th and 18th century, the punishment as it was related to madness, it gave it a kind of discursive power, right. But with the passage of time, we find that how those things were put under chains. So, he says that individuals working within a particular practices cannot think or speak without obeying the unspoken archive of rules and constraints. Otherwise, they risk being condemned to madness or silence. So, this discursive mastery works not just by exclusion, but also by rarefaction. Each practice narrows its meaning by thinking only in terms of author and discipline. Right? So there are social constraints, especially formative power of education system. And in this way, Foucault looks at history and he considers history as a disconnected range of discursive practices. So in this way, Foucault focuses on the fundamental shifts occurring between epochs, and he offers no periods of generalizations, but traces the overlapping series of discontinuous fields. And he comes to the conclusion that the will to power exhibited in the regulation of this archive is an impersonal force. We can never know from our own era's archives because it is the unconscious from which we speak. And in this way, he says that how this will to power is, is an impersonal force. He says that if we look at history, we may find that, policing of knowledge is being done by individuals. For example, Plato, Kant, Saussure, Derrida, Aquinas, Locke. In this way they constitute various practices. However, he says that knowledge is beyond any individual consciousness and therefore it becomes impersonal. So the will to knowledge is an impersonal force. If we look at all these individual thinkers, a set of rules emerges and in this way that remains impersonal. Right. For example, he says that in this way we can understand this tendency when we are remote from that period. And we can understand an earlier archive only because we are utterly different and remote from it. And in the order of things, Foucault shows that during the Renaissance, resemblance played a central role in the structure of knowledge. He says everything echoed everything else, nothing stood in its own. For example, he gives examples of John Donne's poetry. And there we find that John Donne is always describing things in context of the other. For example, human emotions, they are compared with tremors, as we have seen in Valediction Forbidding Mourning at various places. So in this way, from a modern standpoint, we can see the various kinds of correspondence which shape Renaissance discourses. But the writers themselves could not see it back then. And following Nietzsche, Foucault contends that we can never possess an objective knowledge of history. Historical writings are always entangled within tropes, and these tropes do not allow history to become objective, right? So it is always subjectivities which are there in history, subjectivities which are sanctioned by the state, and in this way they emerge as knowledge systems. So he says that how in politics and science, everywhere, this knowledge or power is gained through discourse. So discourse is a violence we do to things, and any claim to objectivity is a myth. So in this way, in this lecture, we have been able to look at these French thinkers who contributed to the thought process of post-structuralism. Thank you.